For 3 years, sailors have been brutally attacked off the coast of Spain and Portugal. The Coast Guard has received desperate calls from people who tell of an aggressive gang that suddenly appears from the bottom of the sea. A gang that launches targeted attacks. Who exactly is this gang? Who have been terrorizing sailors out on the Atlantic for years? And why do many scientists believe that the attacks are an act of revenge? What first started as emergency calls from terrified sailors to the Coast Guard has now almost become a trend. And perhaps most importantly, this whole case has become a matter of life and death. This all started 3 years ago, in the summer of 2020, when 23-year-old biology student Victoria Morris was on a sailing trip off the Spanish coast with some friends. In the sparkling water, they all had, to their great horror and delight, discovered a group of killer whales who appeared curiously around the boat. Victoria had sailed a lot before and was used to seeing orcas who would follow boats for a while before losing interest. But soon heart rates would start to rise on the boat. The pod of 9 or so killer whales circled closer and closer, then started to push and pound on the hull of the boat. Victoria looked at the steering wheel and saw that it was spinning out of control. She realized that the big animals had grabbed the rudder from the underside and was now in full control of the boat. The sailboat began to turn round and round in the water, while several whales continued to pound the sides. Fearing the worst, Victoria ran below deck to get life vests. While she was below deck, she heard something fascinating. It seemed as if the orcas were communicating and coordinating the attack. They were pounding the sides in sync. Victoria panicked. She dialed the Coast Guard's number and yells,
"Mayday! Mayday! Orca attack!"
On the other end, she could hear the Coast Guard getting confused. She repeated the distress call multiple times before the Coast Guard confirmed that help was on the way. But then, after a tense and panic-filled hour, the attack stopped as quickly as it had started. Not long after, the Coast Guard shows up and tows them back to shore. And it turned out that the boat had suffered extensive damage and bite marks all along the hull, and their rudder was completely gone. The whole thing was blown off as an anomaly, as it's very rare and unusual for orcas to act aggressive towards humans. But this was only the beginning. Throughout the summer of 2020, the Coast Guard got flooded by emergency calls from terrified sailors. They told of a merciless pod of orcas that would brutally attack their boats. Many sailors injured, falling over from the orcas' repeated pounding. Others even had their hulls flooded and their boats sunk. Many filmed their encounters and put it out on social media platforms, where it would get the attention of news networks all over the world. Soon, one traumatized sailor after another appeared in articles telling how they were exposed to the orcas' relentless attacks.
Suddenly, I felt a jolt. The boat spun around 180 degrees and was facing north. That was when my wife spotted the orcas. The first thing I did was radio the Coast Guard for help.
Portuguese and Spanish authorities were unable to do much. The Iberian orca is critically endangered, with an estimate of 30 to 40 individuals left, and thus also protected. At first, the authorities advised the sailors to keep distance from the orca, but this was useless, as it was the whales who were seeking out the boats and not the other way around. But finally, the authorities decided to close parts of the coast and restrict where smaller boats were allowed to travel. The authorities had done what they could, but the attacks continued, and scientists were left with a series of unanswered questions as to what was causing the sudden change in behavior. with the support of a few NGOs, a group of marine scientists led by Professor Ruth Esteban, decided to investigate what the reason for the attacks were. They put on their diving suits and underwater cameras and went out to the parts of the Atlantic where the attacks had occurred. After following the killer whales for weeks and collecting data, they had a small breakthrough. It turned out that the attacks were performed by one single pod of around 30 orcas. This pod had been swimming up and down the coast of Spain, Portugal, and Gibraltar for decades, and was really one big family, consisting of everything from grandmothers to grandchildren. But there were some individuals in this pod who would attract the researchers' interest more than others. By identifying the orcas based on the fin, which functions as a kind of fingerprint, the researchers could compare videos from the attacks with their own footage, and they noticed that there were 3 orcas in particular that were involved in almost all the attacks. These were 3 quite young orcas, teenagers, who behaved a bit more rebellious and mischievous than the others in the pod. And because of their color and pattern, they were named Gladys White, Gladys Grey, and Gladys Black. So now the researchers began to speculate whether the 3 were the ringleaders of the attacks. But soon the researchers made a new discovery. The scientists noticed that Gladys White had a big scar on his head, and also covered in several scars along his body. These did not look like natural injuries. These scars were from something that cut deep and repetitively, like propellers. The discovery of the injuries gave way for a new theory, that the attacks were an act of revenge. But this was not the only theory. Blue-finned tuna is the Iberian orca's favorite source of prey, but it's also one of the most overfished by humans. The theory is that the killer whales are trying to get rid of their competition, the boats, which threatens the pod's existence by stealing their food. Another theory is the massage theory, which speculates that killer whales like to swim behind the propellers of boats because the pressure from the turbines gives them a kind of face massage. But when they come across boats that don't have them on, like sailboats, they get frustrated and try to force the propeller to turn on.
It's very difficult to find the cause. The orcas aren't telling us. But what we can say with a high probability is that it's related to a variety of interactions with humans. We think it's a learned behavior over time, which is passed on to the rest of the group.
Much like humans, killer whales are obsessed with trends. In 1987, a study was done on an orca who started swimming around with a dead salmon. Then she decided to use it as a hat on her head. A couple of weeks later, the researchers could see that her entire pod and other pods in the immediate area began to do the same. She had simply started a trend. And one theory the researchers now have is that these 3 gang leaders have started a trend of their own. But despite the theories and speculations, there are still no concrete answers. And in 2022, the orcas would hit harder than ever before. In November of that year, another sailboat was attacked. The killer whales used the same tactics as before. They pounded the sides and took control of the rudder. The boat suffered such heavy blows and damage that it began to take in large quantities of water, and the sailors on board realized that they were sinking. With water up to their knees, they were rescued at the last minute by the Coast Guard, while the boat ended up on the bottom of the sea. Currently in 2023, 3 boats have been sunk in a similar fashion, and will undoubtedly be followed by more, as the orcas don't seem to be slowing down anytime soon. The sinking of the boats has given the situation a more serious tone. What started as a minor nuisance is now threatening human life. They are currently protected, but scientists are afraid that if they continue to threaten human life, it could end in death. One can only hope that the orcas stop this behavior, because if this whole thing is a game, then they are playing with fire.